Welcome to this week's Insights. This is your host, Eric Hacopian. During this week's show, we're going to talk about two specific topics. One, I want to talk about the rules governing the elections and the post-election period and how governments are formed or not formed after this Sunday's election. In the second part of the show, we're going to be discussing this week's visit to the occupied city of Shushi in Artsakh by Erdogan and Aliyev during this week. Let's talk about the parliamentary system. For people who are not familiar with parliamentary systems, they're actually far different than presidential systems in the way that they assign seats and how power is gained. After this week's elections, there are essentially three possible outcomes after this Sunday. One, that a single party manages to win 54% of the seats and can form a government on its own. Number two is that there's a coalition government, i.e. multiple parties put together their seats to get to 54% in order to be able to form a government. And the third option is that since there's only 6 days in the post-election period for any political force to create a government, that no government is formed because the parties cannot agree with themselves, which at that point will trigger a runoff election between the top two finishers in this Sunday's elections. Now let's explain how parties get into parliament. In order to get into parliament, any party that is running on its own needs to get at least 5% of the votes cast. So anything above that 5% threshold will get you into the parliament. If you are an electoral bloc, or as it is referred to in Armenian as a dashing, in which you are in a coalition, that threshold becomes 7%. For example, Mr. Kocharyan's political force is actually a dashing, which means they would need to get at least 7% of the vote to enter parliament, which they're almost certain to do. After that, the parliament itself actually does not begin the process of electing the next prime minister. It is the president that asks the person who finished first to try to form a government. In the case that there is no dominant party, i.e. no one's won 54% of the vote or above, all the parties are free to work within themselves to try to form a government. Even if you're not the party that finished first, you'll be able to form a government if you can put together a coalition of different parties that can put you at 54%. Let's move on to the second subject of today's show, which was Erdogan and Aliyev's visit to the occupied city of Shushi. We were all subjected to the pictures of Erdogan and Aliyev overlooking the cliffs of Shushi, holding hands together like little boys. Let's understand a little bit of what this means. Here you have, in the case of Mr. Erdogan, the leader of the second largest army in NATO, visiting a town in which his troops ethnically cleansed people, in this case Armenians, out of, nearly 100 years after another Turkish army ethnically cleansed Armenians out of Shushi in 1918, murdering thousands of civilians in the process. All of this is happening in Europe. In 1999, almost all the major European powers got together to go to war with Serbia about an attempted ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. After that war, the Kosovars got remedial secession and independence. What we have gotten since last year's war is silence and empty words by all the great European powers. The reasons for this are very complicated, and they can, in fact, you can write books about them. But for the purposes of this show, the answer to that question is simple. Our lives don't matter, and we are not on the world's approved list of victims. But let's not blame others, since their silence, frankly, only tells us what we are worth at this current time in the eyes of the world, which is pretty much nothing. The road that led Erdogan and Aliyev to the hills of Shushi was built by us, and this is how it was built. The road was built when we allowed our country for 30 years to be run by thieves or incompetents, sometimes either and sometimes both. That road was built by church leaders who care more about their real estate holdings than the moral of ethics of our leadership class. That road was built when we built an economy of casinos and restaurants rather than factories and research facilities. That road was built every time someone bought a PhD in our universities without earning one, or buying grades on all different levels of our education system. That road was built when we allowed a culture of incompetence to destroy our army, so that our soldiers were led into battle by commanders and generals that were not worthy of leading them into battle. In conclusion, to quote Shakespeare, our faults lie not in our stars, but in ourselves. I would suggest that we take use of those pictures of these two fascist degenerates on the hills of Shushi. I would suggest that we put that photo in every school in Armenia, in every factory, in every government office, in every diaspora school, in every cultural institution that we have anywhere in the world. Because there's nothing that tells us of what we need to do and the country that we need to build than looking at that photograph on a daily basis. Thank you for joining us for this week's episodes of Insights with Eric Hacopian.